Hey everyone. All right, we are back for part 1, chapter 1 of the lesson. And Hazlitt opens up talking about how economics on its own would have a bit of a natural complexity to it since it is a science, but it is made more complicated by the pleading of special interests who want to plead their own case and their own version of economics. That makes it 1,000 times more complicated than, say, mathematics or other sciences or medicine that don't have to deal with this. On top of that, that was paragraph 1, by the way. That was his opener. Paragraph 2, before I get into paragraph 2, I want to quickly mention an observation of mine that I think will reinforce paragraph 2. My observation is that people in general, especially when it comes to money, they do not proact, they react. Or just problems in general, they don't proact, they react. And it's human nature. I've just come to realize that it's human nature. And you're not going to, even if you have all the correct advice, you're not going to change the world necessarily. You can help a few people. But anyway, so going into paragraph 2, Hazlitt says, okay, so on top of the natural complexity of economics, and on top of all the special pleadings that make it even more complicated, add to that the persistent tendency of men to see only the immediate effects of a given policy. Persistent tendency of men. Sounds like human nature to me. So basically, Hazlitt is saying, okay, on top of all these other things, you have human nature. People are reactionary. And so they focus on the now at the expense of the future. He goes on to talk about what makes a good economist versus a bad economist. And basically, a bad economist only concentrates on one part of a problem, only maybe on one group, or not on how it will affect things beyond the immediate problem time-wise. Well, a good economist will look at the whole picture and how a policy will affect things now and in the future. He talks about how people will accept common sense when it comes to an individual. Hey, don't spend more money than you make. Hey, little boy, if you eat too much candy, you're going to get sick. That's common sense. Not that it's going to stop a little boy from eating too much candy or a little girl. I was guilty of that, so I know. But when it comes to an adult, hey, don't spend more money than you make. You'll go bankrupt. That's common sense. But you take that individual and you place him in a group, a taxpayer base, or whatever you want to label it as a group. What was common sense for that individual? Common sense advice. Now the opposite. Top of the food chain economists will apply the opposite advice for that person when they are in a group. Meaning, hey, you don't need to save. Spend as much as you can. Hey, spending more than we have is the way to economic salvation. And they may rationalize it by certain things. Hazlitt gives examples, but basically it's just different versions of I don't care because. And the I don't care because that I've heard recently is because, well, things are so bad now. And yes, they're not great, but there's always something bad happening. I don't claim to have invented this, but I didn't read this anywhere. It occurred to me that this is sort of a reactionary cycle. Now, Hazlitt talks about how you can't have an I don't care attitude because right now the problems we're living through were most likely due to bad policy that was previously enacted, okay? We are living that future. That what was previously considered the future is now our current. It's now our current. It's our problem now. So what I was thinking of is this is sort of a reactionary cycle. You have a past reactionary economic policy decision. It begets bad consequences, which begets further, more forceful reactionary policy. And so it's this vicious cycle. Hazlitt talks about how sometimes these consequences aren't known right away. Sometimes, they may be evident in, weeks or months. Sometimes they may take years, and sometimes they may take decades. But you can count on it happening, because surely as the hen was in the egg and the flower was in the seed, those are his examples, the bad results of bad policy will come to fruition. It's at this point that he states the lesson. Let me take a drink here. And I'm going to read it because he says that it can be reduced to one sentence. This lesson of economics, it's a long sentence, but it's one sentence. Here it is. The art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups. And the next part of the chapter talks about how most economic problems stem from ignoring this lesson. There are usually two parts or two main ways to ignore this lesson causing problems. Either you only look at the immediate results and not the long-term results, or you only look at how it affects one group, abstracted, and not the whole community. In fact, the central sophism of the new economics, which, it was new back then, it's new now, it's modern now. The central sophism is to basically just focus on one group in the now. And I don't know if you know what a sophism is, but it is basically a false argument intent on deception. So they know what they're doing. He also brings up, and I think it's important to highlight, that a classical economist who looks at what long-term consequences are can make a mistake by only looking at the long-term consequences. For instance, if a policy is enacted and it throws a whole industry of people out of work, there should be accommodation made. If you don't care because, it doesn't matter, because in the long run, everybody's going to benefit. Well, people got to eat. So don't be callous, make an accommodation. Maybe you need to retrain people. But even though that is a mistake, Hazlitt brings up how the worst mistake is to not take into account the long-term consequences. That is the worst mistake by the bad economist. The last part talks about how bad economists may be perceived as presenting their arguments better than a good economist, because maybe the good economist is a little boring. Maybe his podcasts are 45 minutes long and people might lose interest. But my answer to that is that if a bad economist is presenting the good news of half-truths, of course people are going to be more interested. So it's better for the good economist to present the other half, as in the long-term consequences, and make people see what the results will be. So a bad economist in their argumentation might call a good economist who is boring many things. The latest one I've heard is stopped clock. That guy's a stopped clock. Well, if something takes decades to come to fruition, they're not really a stop clock. They're just telling you early. So anyway, Hazlitt states the nature of the lesson, which is I read to you. He's talked about the fallacies in abstract terms. Next, he's going to go in to illustrate the examples, starting with Bastiat's broken window. So I hope that you come back and please comment on the book. All right, thanks. Bye.